War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 44, the Rhodesian Civil War's Fireforce. As noted in previous episodes, in asymmetric warfare, the weaker power seeks to avoid presenting large targets to the stronger power, to only mass on a temporary basis to inflict the requisite political message through military power, and then to dissipate into safety. The key for the stronger power is to find that massed force in time to destroy them before they can flee to a sanctuary. For the weaker power, stealth, secrecy, and a safe haven are essential. For the stronger power, good intelligence, speed of decision-making, and speed of movement are required to bring their assumed firepower advantage to bear against the enemy. To avoid a rehashing of the, to me at least, interesting background of the Rhodesian Civil War, this will try to focus specifically on the fire force and how the key points of intelligence and speed were nearly perfected. To start with the technical aspects, the tactics of fire force were driven by the equipment available. It must be noted that the Rhodesian military was severely shackled by highly punitive sanctions from its previous Western allies, despite fighting against a communist insurgency. The basic infantry unit was the stick of 4 men. This is a change from the normal 8 to 12 men of a squad, and was driven by the primary helicopter, the French Alouette, being only capable of carrying 4 men, in addition to the crew. The stick was a fairly standard makeup of a stick leader, a machine gunner with an FN MAG, basically a M240 7.62 belt-fed machine gun, and 2 riflemen with grenades and ammunition. One of the riflemen a trained medic with an aid bag, and the other usually carrying a radio. At times, there would be 2 radios in a single stick, allowing the stick to subdivide into 2-man groups. Units built up from the 4-man stick and could combine as required to make up groups of over 30 men, depending on the circumstances. The speed of movement was provided almost entirely by aircraft initially. The fire force would have a group of usually 4 helicopters. The G car or gunship car would carry the 4 men of the stick, with a pilot and technician, or tech for short, who acted as a gunner, with either a single FN Mag machine gun or twin Browning machine guns chambered in the older .303 British cartridge. There would ordinarily be 3 G cars and a fire force. The 4th helicopter was the K car for kill or command. The fire force commander would ride in this helicopter and conduct command and control from the air, though he did have a radio which would allow him to dismount and fight on the ground if circumstances required, though this was not the preferred solution. The K car also carried a heavier gun, either a 20mm cannon or quad .303 Browning, though the former was preferred. The 50 caliber machine gun was experimented with and found lacking. The Rhodesian experience mirrored my own. The larger and heavier guns still required a direct hit to be effective, and against unarmored cars and men, the extra weight wasn't worth it. The 50 caliber was designed to be an anti-aircraft gun, which, previous to the days of missiles, it proved effective. But even by the end of World War II, 20mm cannons were replacing the 50 caliber machine guns for this role. It does give you a longer range compared to the standard 7.62 NATO, but the opportunities to use this longer range are minimal. And since the Rhodesian helicopters orbited at a rough altitude of 300 feet, it was almost without value. Even though the 20mm rounds were far more expensive, the bursting ability and high accuracy of the gunners meant a burst of 2 to 4 rounds was usually sufficient to wound or kill their target. In addition to the G and K cars, the star of the show, at least to outside observers, was the World War II era DC-3/C-47 Dakotas, or DACs, from which 5 sticks would normally parachute jump just meters outside the enemy's position to quickly establish an overwhelming force. This use of paratroopers was not driven by a desire or requirement to use airborne vertical envelopment, but rather simply the lack of available helicopters. A CH-47 Chinook would have certainly been preferred if available, and later in the war they were able to acquire UH-1 Hueys, which could carry 2 sticks. In addition to the troop carriers, there would often, but not always, be a twin-propeller Lynx light attack aircraft with twin Browning machine guns and rockets. These are known as O2s in the U.S. military and consisted of a pusher and puller propeller. These could provide instant firepower as needed and were an integral part of the fire force. If the enemy was particularly large, jet bombers such as the British Hunter, Canberra, and even Vampires were available with locally made bombs designed specifically for anti-personnel effects. Throughout the war, there was always a fire force on instantaneous alert. As neither side was equipped for night fighting, they were almost entirely a daytime force. This on-call fire force would occupy a primitive airfield forward, waiting for information of enemy sign. A little on this. The Rhodesians had two special operations units, the all-white Special Air Service and the integrated Sealess Scouts. Both were capable of long-range reconnaissance missions, but the Sealess Scouts were often comprised of former terrorists, or terrors, who had been turned. This gave them outstanding intelligence on enemy locations and actions. However, it sometimes turned out that these terrorists weren't so turned and murdered their teammates. These groups would go out sometimes in only 2 people for weeks into the bush, searching for groups of enemies. The scouts were not limited to Rhodesian territory. Fire force would often penetrate into neighboring Mozambique or Zambia, from which the Chinese-backed Shona-speaking Zanla or Soviet-backed Netabeli tribesmen of Zipra were based. These two groups were as much at war with each other as they were with the Rhodesians, which allowed the Rhodesians more time in their ultimately unsuccessful anti-communist counterinsurgency. Of historical note, it was the Mugabe-led Zanla who ultimately gained control of Zimbabwe. When sign of enemy guerrillas were found, a literal siren went off at the Fire Force base, and the first vehicle in the air was the K-car with the commander. He was talked on to the objective by the reconnaissance patrol who found the enemy. The G-cars followed closely behind. The plan for the battle was made up on site, and the Fire Force commander's ability to very quickly make a good enough plan was the difference between success and failure, and often life or death. Not every commander was very good at this. His first priority was to determine where to place his stop groups found in the G-cars. Standard insurgent technique is to flee as soon as possible, in different directions, upon discovery by the stronger power. The Rhodesians called this technique bombshelling. In Afghanistan, we called it pissing. Taliban would piss out the back, and if you couldn't get behind them, they would flee successfully into the hills and valleys. In Fire Force, the obviously faster helicopters would position their 3 sticks onto hills overlooking suspected bombshell routes, or put them in gullies that the enemy may use. The successful Fire Force commander would think like an insurgent and be able to predict his enemy's actions, and if wrong, be able to bring the firepower of the K-car or Lynx to kill those who weren't trapped by the stop groups of the G-cars. After the stop groups were in place, then the sweep group, generally carried by the DAC, would come in and drop a line of infantrymen who would sweep through the objective, pushing the terrorists into, ideally, the waiting stop groups. This drop was usually at 500 feet and sometimes as low as 300. Injuries were common, but they wanted as little time in the air as possible, as well as keeping the paratroopers as close as possible when they dropped. The lower the altitude, the closer they would be on the ground. While a combat drop in the U.S. military is exceedingly rare, only about a half a dozen in the 20 years of GWOT, there were Rhodesians who had dozens of combat drops during the 10 or so years of Fire Force. The key part of Fire Force being flexibility. None of this was written in stone. Sometimes a Fire Force would be all helicopter-borne, or the Lynx might be missing. But the description I gave is the general idea. Of course, the enemy, upon hearing the helicopters, would start their bombshell even before the stop groups were in. The 20mm cannon of the K-car would sometimes be enough to slow down or stop the guerrillas from slipping away, but not always. The speed in which the stop groups were put down was key. The sweep group had a few means of moving forward. The primary was the on-line marching ahead, where the whole sweep group would move forward together at a steady pace. At times, the sweep group would move one flank at a time. The left stopped while the right moved until they were in a good cover position, and then the left moved forward in what is known as a bounding overwatch. If the terrain didn't allow, then half the men would stop while the other half would walk through the stopped line in what was called the pepper pot, more random individuals getting up and moving, which didn't allow the enemy to predict the next movement. This was far harder to control and more prone to friendly fire, but the discipline and training made it possible. Fire support was dependent upon the Lynx or K-car. Pen flares and white phosphorus grenades were used by every trooper who could mark a target for air support as required. Decision-making was highly decentralized throughout the Fire Force. Stick leaders and stop groups could reposition on their own authority based upon what was happening. The Fire Force commander was deconflicting 8 separate sticks plus the circling G-cars and K-cars, in addition to any fixed-wing support available. Ultimately, the point was to put the terrorists, as they were called, into a dilemma where they could neither move nor stay still. If they moved, the circling helicopters could engage them, or they would walk into the stop groups. If they stayed still, the advancing sweep group could engage or direct fire from the Lynx, K-car, or G-car onto their position. And this is where my conflict with Sun Tzu's demand to always leave an outlet for your enemy stems. A well-executed fire force gives nothing to your enemy. This was the general makeup and tactics of the Fire Force's first wave, and this was the heart of the Fire Force, but not its only component. Just as important was the second wave land tail, which would move to pick up the sticks and reinforce and rearm the first wave if it was a long battle. The land tail would move as soon as possible to minimize delay, but if the Fire Force had moved deep into hostile territory, each trooper was equipped for at least an overnight stay if required. Forward refueling bases for the helicopters were often set up by the land tail or even paradropped, which allowed the Alouettes to quickly refuel and rearm to provide continuous support. The Fire Force was the primary offensive tactic of the Rhodesian military. The country is far too vast for ground-based defenses and the Rhodesian military too resource-strapped. The mobility, rapidity of deployment, and decentralized decision-making were all force multipliers that, had the Rhodesians received even a modicum of support, would have probably been successful in stopping the communist takeover. One of my many frustrations in Afghanistan is such tactics could have greatly reduced our footprint and casualties. But our helicopters were too precious to be used for actual combat, requiring usually weeks of pre-planning, which, of course, would end up wasted on expired intelligence. So we drove around in armored cars, getting blown up by landmines, taking unnecessary casualties in a bias towards fruitless action, our exquisitely expensive equipment ultimately becoming an albatross rather than an asset. Only general officers and the most elite special operations forces were allocated anything resembling responsive aviation support. The limitation for the Rhodesians, aside from logistics, was the ability of the SEAL scouts and SAS to locate the enemy. In a modern twist, the subject of last week's podcast, drones, could provide this capability and probably much better. The talk-on portion requiring the man on the ground to explain the enemy situation to the airborne commander could be a live feed from the UAV, allowing them to see the situation, giving more time for the commander to formulate his plan. Such a configuration with a platoon of Blackhawks and a single Chinook would have allowed a single on-call company to control a province in Afghanistan, which usually consumed an entire brigade during the height of the Afghanistan campaign. The cost of the additional aviation assets required to enable this would be infinitesimal compared to the cost of maintaining tens of thousands of additional soldiers in a ponderously slow and ultimately failed counterinsurgency. The U.S. military, since the time of the Civil War, has relied upon a preponderance of money and supplies to deliver victory after an agonizingly slow buildup, usually predicated on a few losses up front. But money makes you stupid, and stupid is expensive, and as we have learned since Vietnam, often a failure. Fighting forces poor in resources must be rich in creativity and leadership to be successful. The Rhodesian failure was ultimately not one of fighting ability, but rather lack of political support and crushing embargoes. Ironically, the Rhodesians did not create the idea of heliborne counterinsurgency forces. The French in Algeria were the first, and of course the Americans in Vietnam were famous for their uses. These earlier incarnations are likewise worth looking at, which we will next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.